existence has ended in betrayal, not peace. I think when European leaders try to cooperate with Hitler, for example, through the Munich Agreement, I think they didn't prevent the war. I think they enabled it, giving Germany the time and the legitimacy to expand and slaughter millions. And maybe when nations trusted Japan before World War II, I think it was repaid with invasion and occupation. So I think when all opposition claims that we should cooperate with the Trisolarans and the alien species that already declared Earth as their new home, I think they're not advocating the peace. I think they're actually advocating the pre-surrender themselves. Because when the other side's survival actually depends on your existence, for example, diplomacy is not the path to the coexistence themselves. It's a manual for your own annihilation. I think what's the framing is debate. I think this debate is not whether the war is good or bad. I think it's about which path actually preserves humanity, long survival, dignity, and autonomy when facing the existential threat. I think we frame this debate on moral and practical grounds. I think practically, resistance is the only national strategy that actually used a 400-year window to actually develop the technology and the United Nations and to prepare the future generations. And this actually turns the line into power themselves. But secondly, morality. I think resistance is the only path that keeps the humanity human, not the path of slaves under an alien order. But thirdly, the question is not like, oh, should we fight or talk? The real question is, do we want to survive as a species or simply exist as a servant in someone else's home? And that is why on our side as CG, I think we stand for the armed resistance, not an aggression, but as the only dignified from this form of the survival. What do we need to do in this debate? Three things. Firstly, I think diplomacy is structurally impossible under the current power of asymmetry because the Trisolarans do not view humans as equal but as resources. But secondly, how resistance maximizes both survival and probability and the autonomy by uniting the humanity, accelerating technology, innovation, and so on. But thirdly, how the moral value of the freedom and dignity actually outweighs the short-term comfort of the submission, meaning even if the diplomacy themselves are temporary prevents violence, it will come at the cost of losing human sovereignty forever. But what opposition did to prove that? Three things. I think how the Trisolarians who already decide to colonize Earth are willing to negotiate or compromise their core interest in the survival. But secondly, humanity through the diplomacy can preserve both its existence and autonomy without being manipulated or overpowered. But thirdly, I think the time used for diplomacy would lead to the tangible safety outcomes. But I think three things they have failed to prove to us. I think firstly, they never solved the asymmetry problem. How the Trisolarans have zero incentive to respect our position since they see us as inferior life forms. But secondly, they misunderstood diplomacy as peace. I think when in reality you know that diplomacy under existential is trapped in the coercion, not the cooperation themselves. But thirdly, they cannot guarantee the survival, basically because their plan depends entirely on the goodwill of an alien species whose only motivation is planetary survival. Then, what about fruit of the actors? Firstly, of course, the future generations of humanity that actually direct the consequences of what we decide today. But secondly, the global scientific technological community. Moving on to my arguments, I would like to extend that. Firstly, on the armed resistance, how it actually catalyzed the unprecedented human unity and technologically. I think prioritizing armed resistance actually create the political and material conditions for global unity and the concentrated innovations that are impossible under a diplomacy-first approach. I think if it's faced with an existential external threat, for example, states and scientific communities and civil society, in the end of the day, will actually unify and that there are actually pool resources and to pursue accelerated R&D and so whatever it is. I think this could actually produce a defensive technologies and so on, and this is actually bad, right? What's the importance of them? I think three main analysis. Firstly, I think this is actually important because this debate is not merely whether we can avoid an immediate clash. I think it's about who we become in the 400 years before the fleet actually arrives. I think the mode of collective response determines our survival probability by orders of magnitude. I think a fracture, a pressing whole world actually sacrifices centuries of innovation and training. I think a unified, resistance-oriented world converts those centuries into concrete military, for example, scientific and societal advantage, right? How do we weight this then? I think weight this impacts by scale, probability, and permanence, right? I think the unity plus innovation pathway scores extremely high on scale, which this actually affects all the humanity and both the probability, which is a systemically that actually increase chance of defeating or deterring the invasion. I think, and this is permanent because it creates the institution and tech that actually protects those successive generations. I think opposition diplomacy first claim that may offer a short-term reduction in violence, for example, small-scale cavalry, but it scores poorly on the probability of the long-term survival and permanence because it institutionalized the dependency and the hands exercise before knowledge of the enemy themselves. But I think OG already told you that military power actually calms people down. I think how do we extend this then? I think we already tell you why that feeling actually matters, how this manifests you institutionally, and what consequences it has for the survival. I think the way is simple. The real impact of psychological calm is not just comfort themselves. I think it's the preservation of the social order, rational decision making, and the sustained productivity over shackles. I think because when fear is not managed, people don't just panic. They will riot at the end of the day. They will stop working. They destroy the coordination, making even diplomacy collapse from their inside. And I think armed resistance is not only about protecting those bodies, but more about protecting the minds, the system, and the legitimacy themselves. But how do we compare this framing against opposition then? Take an example on COVID-19. I think societies with visible government preparation, like soldiers distributing aid, lockdown protocols, and so on, they have less panic than those that trusted global cooperation with no tangible defense, right? I think likewise, this diplomacy without readiness is not the peace. I think it's like how the powerlessness and actually appears, right? But what did opposition fear about this then? They would likely say, oh, but militarization actually increases fear, reduces people see guns and panic, for example. I think untrue. Fear will increase when people see it uncertainly, not when they see defense. Physical preparation signals control. Even if militarization, for example, creates a temporary tension, exactly, that fear is what sustains these disciplines and the vigilance themselves, which is actually essentially the 400-year lead up, right? I think let's flip this. If fear actually exists either way, we'd rather it be organized fear under the resistance than an uncontrolled hysteria, for example, under a diplomacy then. But moving on to my rebuttals then, quick clarifications on what opposition has said. I think it's untrue that aliens don't have any power or they cannot harm things in the air, because firstly, we already tell you, even from the basic logic, a species capable for interstellar travel